Holy Spirit. Oh, no, no.
And she says, well, I love you, and I don't want to, to go on without you, and to be involved in anything else doesn't mean anything to me.
Al Green's music dripped with love and devotion, but behind the smooth falsetto and gospel roots was a life tangled in controversy. From the infamous boiling grits incident to whispers of domestic violence, financial scandals, and even a family member pulling a gun on him, his story is as dramatic as any song he ever sang. He went from topping the charts to preaching in his own church, only to be accused of mismanaging its funds. And while the world saw a soul legend, those closest to him saw a far more complicated man. So, how did Al Green go from R&B royalty to a figure surrounded by chaos? Let's get into it.
All I can say, no.
Al Green, absolute legend. The man made love songs sound like actual magic. He started out singing gospel as a kid. Then his family moved up north, and suddenly, R&B was on his radar. Fast forward, and by the early 70s, he was untouchable. Every song, a masterpiece. Let's Stay Together, Tired of Being Alone, Love and Happiness, all dripping in that smooth, buttery falsetto with the kind of sound that felt like a warm hug. Shout out to producer Willie Mitchell, who helped him craft tracks that basically redefined romance. But just when it seemed like he had it all, fame, fortune, hit after hit, things got messy. Behind closed doors, things got real dark, real fast, so much so that it completely flipped his world upside down. Al was blindsided by something straight out of a nightmare. One minute, he's at home, and the next, Mary throws a pot of boiling grits on him, leaving him with burns so bad he needed serious medical care. Before he could even process what just happened, she went into another room and took her own life with his gun.
I said, what's that? She says, I love you. I said, well, okay, great, then you love me, I like you too. So I ain't no problem with it.
Turns out, the woman he thought was just a random concert goer at a prison show wasn't exactly who she claimed to be. She told him she was visiting a friend, but in reality, she was a married mother of 2 from New Jersey, and she never mentioned a word about it.
Well, see, there's one thing she didn't tell me. I find out after the incident happened that she was married, had 3 kids. I didn't know none of these things. I asked her, before when I first met her, say, are you married? She says, no.
Things really took off between Al and Mary after he invited her to a show in San Francisco. Not long after he got back to Memphis, she called out of the blue to say she was in town. Green later admitted he was so caught up in her that he ignored the weird gut feeling he got whenever she started talking like she could predict the future. One day, while he was in the studio, he got a call from a sheriff. Woodson had been arrested at the Peabody Hotel for smoking weed. He rushed over to smooth things out, and just like that, she was free. Instead of calling it a night, they headed back to the studio, where Green hoped his music would settle her down. Apparently, it did. Al Green was already walking on eggshells with Mary when his friend, Carlotta Williams, a flight attendant, popped up unannounced and gave him a big hug. Given Woodson's unpredictable energy, he braced for drama, but instead, she and Carlotta hit it off. Later that night, they all ended up back at Green's place, and just to shut down any assumptions, he made it crystal clear. This wasn't some kind of late-night setup. His house had plenty of rooms, and everyone was on their own. Al knew something was off when he walked in and saw Mary standing over a pot of boiling water, looking tense. Then, out of nowhere, she hit him with a question about marriage. That was not the conversation he was expecting. Not wanting to get into it right then, he brushed it off, figuring they could talk later. They kissed, and just as he started to relax, she reassured him that she would never do anything to hurt him. That should have been a red flag, but instead, thinking everything was fine, he went upstairs to take a shower.
And she says, well, I love you, and I don't want to, to go on without you, and to be involved in anything else doesn't mean anything to me.
Al Green was brushing his teeth when he heard something behind him. He glanced in the mirror. Mary was standing there holding a pot. Before he could react, she launched it at him. It wasn't just water. She had mixed in grits, turning it into a thick, scalding paste that stuck to his skin. The pain was instant and unbearable. His screams shook the house. Carlotta Williams, hearing the chaos, ran out of her room just as Green bolted past her, barely able to stand. He stumbled into the bathroom where she helped him into the tub, cranking the cold water in a desperate attempt to cool his burns. Just when he thought the worst had passed, another wave of pain hit, forcing another scream out of him. But then, bang, a loud noise from the other room. Something heavy hitting the floor. He and Williams locked eyes, both realizing this nightmare wasn't over. Mary had left the room after attacking him, but whatever was happening next, he knew it was bad.
Just get me to the hospital. I says, I am hurting. See? And by then, man, I had big boils all over my back, man.
Mary grabbed Al's gun, fired a shot into the wall, and then turned it on herself. It was a shocking and tragic end to a night that had already spiraled into something unthinkable.
All of a sudden, you hear, and that was the end of that. You hear something hit the floor, boom, and that was the end of that. I said, what's that noise? She said, sound like gunshots. I said, this can't be that. Come on, this is ridiculous. This thing is going crazy.
Later, a note in her purse revealed she had already tried to end her life days before, taking sleeping pills and cutting her wrists. Meanwhile, Al was rushed to the hospital, where doctors performed multiple skin grafts to treat his burns. Recovery was slow, months of pain, reflection, and soul-searching. He had already embraced Christianity before all this happened, but during those long months of healing, faith became his anchor. He spent his time reading the Bible, praying, and figuring out what came next. Music was still in his blood, but so was his spirituality, and he had to find a way to balance both. Years later, the incident became a pop culture reference, with rappers like Usher and R. Kelly name-dropping him, and Method Man even comparing himself to Al post-Grits. Some turned it into a punchline, but for Al, there was nothing funny about what happened that night.
But I asked people today, I'll sneak off and ask the chief of police today, who's a good friend of mine. I says, did this actually, or was she faking? Or was she joking? That's unbelievable.
Just when Al thought life couldn't get any more bizarre, his own cousin pulled a gun on him, demanding money she claimed he owed her. Most people would have called the cops immediately, but Al, he let it slide. No charges, no drama, just another unbelievable moment in his life. But instead of letting all the chaos break him, he switched gears completely. He didn't just turn to faith, he made it his whole life. He became a minister and even bought his own church in Memphis, where he spent his time preaching when he wasn't out performing. One day, he was topping the charts. The next, he was leading Sunday service. One night during a show, Al hit the stage. Literally. He took a brutal fall, and while most people would have just called it a bad night, he saw it as something bigger. To him, this wasn't just an accident. It was a message loud and clear. Time to leave pop behind and go all in on gospel.
I know one thing I had to do. I had to get into the religious segment, not because I wanted to, but it was the calling, the drawing card to me to come into it. If I accept it, do it.
Switching lanes wasn't exactly easy, though. The world knew him as the king of smooth R&B, and fans weren't trying to hear anything else. Industry folks told him to stick to what sells. But Al wasn't about to ignore what he felt in his soul. No matter what anyone said, he knew gospel was where he belonged.
You know, I said, man, this is too fast. This is too much happening here. One year I'm a rock star, the next year I'm a gospel preacher. This is...
Juggling both worlds wasn't easy. One minute he was dropping a gospel album. The next, he was back to belting out R and B. It wasn't that he couldn't pick a side. He just wasn't trying to. He had love for both, and figuring out how to make them coexist was the real challenge.
It's 75% water instead of 96%, and I got my ratios mixed up there. But see, in the heat,
Every time he hit the stage, that tug of war was right there with him. He wanted to stay locked into his faith and make music that felt true to him, but he also wasn't about to turn his back on the fans who had been rocking with him from the start. But being a religious leader is not a walk in the park. Money problems were nothing new, but this time they came from inside his own church. Being both a gospel singer and a minister meant he had a whole congregation looking up to him, and he took that seriously. But not everyone was convinced he was handling church funds the right way. Some members started side-eyeing his spending habits, accusing him of dipping into church money for personal use instead of putting it toward church needs. That's the kind of drama that shakes people's trust. When folks donate to a church, they expect that money to actually help the church, not end up in the pastor's pockets.
I felt the Holy Spirit, and I couldn't hold my peace.
Things got messy real fast. The church folks weren't just whispering about the money drama anymore. They took Al Green to court. They wanted receipts, answers, and probably a few explanations about where the donations were going. Imagine having to defend yourself against the very people who once called you their leader. For someone in his position, this wasn't just a headache. It was a full-blown reputation crisis. Fans and churchgoers started second-guessing him, and the whole thing could have easily spiraled into something even worse. But before it got to that point, both sides decided to handle it behind closed doors. Instead of dragging it out in court, they settled. Nobody knows exactly what went down in that agreement, but the case disappeared, and Al didn't have to keep fighting this battle in public. Even after settling, the whole situation stuck to Al Green like a stubborn rumor. There's also the domestic violence harassment allegations. Al's personal life has been shadowed by some serious accusations. Over the years, claims of domestic violence have surfaced, sometimes whispered behind closed doors, other times making their way into the public eye. It's a side of his story that's hard to ignore, painting a much darker picture of the man behind the music. His relationships weren't exactly fairy tales. He was married more than once, and some of those marriages ended in disturbing allegations. His first wife, Shirley Green, wasn't just part of his personal life. She was in his music world too, singing backup and working at his church. They had 3 daughters together, but behind the scenes, things were far from perfect. Shirley didn't just leave. She filed for divorce twice, accusing him of abuse. Shirley's story is hard to ignore. She said that while carrying Green's child, 5 months pregnant, he snapped and beat her with a boot just because she said no to sex. Let that sink in. A man famous for singing about love and devotion allegedly left his pregnant wife so badly injured that she needed stitches on her head. You'd think that would have been the final straw. And at first, it was. Shirley filed for divorce, but somehow they ended up back together, trapped in a toxic cycle that kept repeating itself. She later said the violence just got worse, happening more and more often. Green denied it all, until he couldn't. When put under oath in 1982, he finally admitted to hitting her. By the time Shirley finally walked away for good, Green had to cough up $432,800 in alimony and child support. Not that any amount of money could fix what had already happened. Years later, after Nicole Brown Simpson's tragic story shook the world, Shirley decided to break her silence. She wanted other women in toxic situations to know they weren't crazy and they weren't alone. Meanwhile, Green moved on, reportedly remarried. But no matter how far he tried to run, the past had a way of keeping up. Decades earlier, his former secretary, Linda Wills, had already taken legal action, suing him for $25,000 over an alleged assault. And that wasn't the only time his name came up in situations that had nothing to do with love songs and gospel. Not everything happening off stage was as smooth as Green's love songs. At one point, things got ugly over a paycheck dispute. A woman claimed he lost his temper and shoved her straight through a glass door in his Memphis office. But when the details from different witnesses didn't line up, the case fell apart. That wasn't the end of it, though. Al eventually had to shell out $100,000 to settle another lawsuit for assault and battery. Looks like not all of his hits were musical. Al's problems didn't stop there. At one point, his own organ player, Larry Robinson, got into it with him over unpaid money. Things got so bad that Robinson said Green and his bodyguards jumped him. Both men ended up in a Texas jail, but were out soon after posting bail. Just another chapter in the chaos. Then came another serious accusation. A woman named Lovey Smith claimed Green beat her so badly, allegedly with a tree branch, she blacked out. He was hit with assault and battery charges, but the case disappeared when Smith moved away and didn't show up in court. No witness, no trial. All of this made it clear. Green's life wasn't just about gospel and soul. There was a whole other side to him, and it wasn't pretty. Al's family has also been dealing with a heartbreaking mystery for years. His sister, Maxine Green, went missing and hasn't been seen since. She was last spotted at a party store near her assisted living home, but after that, nothing. Maxine struggles with schizophrenia and alcoholism, which makes her disappearance even more concerning. Her family has spent years searching, but they still have no answers. Margaret Green, one of Maxine's sisters, opened up about how painful it's been, saying the lack of closure is unbearable. Imagine trying to sleep at night knowing someone you love just vanished. And to make things even messier, there are reports that Al Green hasn't reached out to the family about it. No calls, no check-ins, just silence. Police are still investigating, and a reward is on the table for any info that could help bring Maxine home, or at least explain what happened to her. For now, the family is left waiting, hoping that someday they'll finally get the answers they need. Now it is said that a lot of why people behave the way they do as adults can be traced back to their childhood.
All I can say, now.
Let's look at Al's childhood. Al Green's life has been anything but boring. Between the music and the mess, he's seen it all. Born into a big family in Forest City, Arkansas, he was one of 10 kids. His parents worked non-stop. His dad was a sharecropper, meaning he farmed land but didn't get to keep most of what he grew. Music was in his blood from the start. By 10, he and his sister were singing as the Green Brothers. But teenage Al? A different story. When his dad caught him blasting Jackie Wilson, he got kicked out of the house. That's when things took a turn. Living on his own, hustling, and running into trouble. But no matter what, he always found his way back to music. Gospel was his foundation, but he had a soft spot for legends like Mahalia Jackson, Elvis Presley, and Wilson Pickett.
Put your hands on your hips, the backbone slip.
Adulthood didn't exactly come easy for Al, like we've talked about. Between chaos, heartbreak, and straight-up disaster, life hit him hard. But somehow, all that darkness seemed to pull him back to the faith he grew up with. A lot of people think those struggles made him lean even harder into religion, trying to find some kind of peace in it. If you really listen to Let's Stay Together, you can hear it. Someone looking for more than just love, but something deeper, something real. And it's not just that song. Take La La for You. Those lyrics aren't just words. They're a man trying to figure out life, love, and everything in between. So You're Leaving is another one of those tracks where you can hear it. Love, heartbreak, and a guy just trying to make sense of it all. Al's life wasn't just about making hits. It was about turning all that pain into something real. Back in high school, he was already chasing the dream. He put together a vocal group with his friends Curtis Rogers and Palmer James, calling themselves Al Green and the Creations. They were hungry to make it big, and for a moment, it looked like they might. They switched things up, rebranding as Al Green and the Soulmates, and dropped Backup Train, which got some attention. But after that, crickets. The hype didn't last, and their album didn't really take off. Then came Willie Mitchell, a producer from Memphis who knew talent when he saw it. He gave Al a shot, inviting him to perform with his band in Texas. One show was all it took. Willie was sold. He brought Al into High Records, setting him up for something way bigger than a one-hit wonder.
When it was over, I said, Jimmy, tell the kid to come over here. So he came over. I said, what you say your name was? He said, Al Green. I said, man, you got a beautiful voice. I said, you can cut a hit record.
When Al Green first hit the scene, he was out here trying to channel the greats. But then Willie stepped in like, nah, let's figure out what you sound like. Once Green locked in his own thing, he even tweaked his name, ditched the extra E, and got ready to drop some heat.
I said, man, you got a beautiful voice. I said, you can cut a hit record. I said, why don't you go back to Memphis with me, and if we work real hard, I said, we can cut some hit records.
His first project with High Records, Green as Blues, did all right. But things really started moving when he dropped Al Green Gets Next to You. His slowed-down, bluesy take on the Temptations' I Can't Get Next to You made some noise, but it was Tired of Being Alone that had everybody in their feelings, and in line to buy records. That track alone sold 1 million copies and kicked off a whole era of gold records for him. Then came Let's Stay Together, and that's when it got serious. That song, straight to #1. It was everywhere, and Green was officially running things in soul music. He kept that streak going with I'm Still in Love with You, which was packed with bangers like Look What You Done For Me and the title track. Next up was Call Me, which gave us You Ought to Be With Me, Call Me, Come Back Home, and Here I Am, Come and Take Me, all major hits. And if you were near a radio back then, you definitely heard Love and Happiness, his take on How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, and Take Me to the River, which later got flipped by Talking Heads and Syl Johnson. Al kept the hits coming with Livin' For You, and later tracks like Sha-La-La Makes Me Happy, Let's Get Married, and L-O-V-E, Love. But by the late 70s, things started shifting. His personal life got messy, and he felt called to switch things up spiritually. The music slowed down, and by the time the Bell album dropped, it was clear he was ready for something different. His last project with High Records, Truth in Time, came and went without much attention, and that was pretty much the end of that era. Al kept making R&B, but the hype started cooling off, and critics were kinda split on his new stuff. That's about the time he saw a sign from above and decided it was time to switch things up. Instead of chasing hits, he put his energy into preaching and gospel music. His first gospel album under High Records led to a whole run of faith-based projects, including one that scored him his first Grammy. He also hopped on Broadway with Patti LaBelle for Your Arms, Too Short to Box with God, and later became the subject of a documentary that gave people a closer look at his life and his church. After some time away from R&B, he linked back up with Willie Mitchell and Angelo Earl for a fresh project, marking his return to secular music. The follow-up album gave him a small hit, Everything's Gonna Be Alright, which finally got him back on the R&B charts, his first time breaking the top 40 in almost a decade, and back to secular music. And while the world still sings along to Let's Stay Together, the truth behind the man who sang it is anything but simple.